Hey guys, Chris from the Ultimate Recycler. Welcome back to the channel. Welcome back to the shed. On the workbench, we have a Honda generator that needs, we don't know. I'll tell you how much I know about this generator. That's it, absolutely nothing. Okay, very quickly, the story is my daughters run a catering business and they recently purchased a coffee van or a food van, secondhand, and thrown in with the deal was this generator. We don't know anything at all about its history. It's a chance that the previous owner may have just used this as a sweetener and it might be totally stuffed. It might be beautifully up to date with its services and runs perfectly. We don't know. So I'm going to take you through a bit of a process on inspecting, assessing, servicing and maybe repairing. And I guess there's a chance that it won't be worth it and we might scrap it out. Hopefully it's a good generator. So let's go through some processes and tick some things off. Now it's a petrol engine, a GX200 Honda, 6.5 horsepower. It's probably 20-25 years old. At least it's a genuine Honda, it's not a Chinese copy. It would be a pretty good quality engine, but it might have been used to death. I have not even pulled the rope, I haven't looked in the tank, I haven't checked the oil, I've done absolutely nothing. So the first thing I'm going to do, I'll take you through a process. I'm not going to try and start it, I'll just pull the rope very slowly. Alright, so it's not seized, I can feel a little bit of compression. I don't want to pull it any faster than that because if it has bad fuel in the carby, it's going to suck it all in. At least I know it's not seized and it hasn't blown up in a catastrophic way. So we've established that. First step, we're going to have a look in the fuel tank to see what's in there and we're going to drain it out because we have no idea when it was last used. Or at least it smells like petrol. There is some fuel in there. So I'm going to take the tank off so I can flush it out and make sure it's clean. I'll take the air filter assembly off. We'll obviously have to check that out. I'll probably take the muffler off as well, just to give us a really good access and we can clean all the cooling fins out. The whole thing is that if the generator is in reasonable condition, my daughters will probably use it. So we want it to have a really good service and make sure it's reliable. This is a good sign. The air filter looks nice and clean. So perhaps it hasn't been neglected after all. Okay, the air filter looks good. That's really good news. Now we might just leave the carby intact for now. I probably will clean it out. I'll certainly check the bowl. We can get the tank off from the one bolt in here and there's two bolts on the other side. There's also a bolt at the top here onto the throttle bracket. So I think we'll take this plastic housing off the front of the carby and then we can remove the throttle bracket and the linkages and get us really good access. So these two nuts here go onto the studs that mount the carby. So they're 10mm. Oops, our frame's in the road there. And there's another bolt up the top here. And this will also allow us access to the fuel line, I think, because the fuel tap's just behind here. And that's the choke. So there's the bracket off. Oh, we've got a little sleeve here that has to stay with that bracket. Okay, it's quite oily around the throat of the carby, which isn't such a bad thing. Much better seeing it oily than watery. Okay, it's been a while since I've done one of these Hondas, but it looks like the fuel line comes out from behind the blower housing. So we'll take all that off as well because, again, I want to make sure all the cooling fins are clear. So the recoil start will come off. Again, they're all 10mm bolts and nuts, so that makes it easy. Okay, everything appears to be in good condition with the recoil start, the pulley and the rope. They look pretty good. There's a little plastic spacer here. Now the cowling, I think there's one bolt back in under there, there'll be one on the other side, there might be two at the bottom, so we'll just undo those bolts. Okay, I've just spotted the first problem. It's not major, but on the throttle linkage or the governor linkage, the end of the spring here is off. So it really it won't stop the engine running, but it just stabilizes the governor. So yeah, we can hook that spring back on. It's not a major problem. Now I think I've got all the bolts off the cowling, so that should now come out. Oops, we have a wire on the back for the stop switch. Okay, this looks more complicated than what it actually is. All it is a switch that earths out the wire from the electronic module, and the wire comes down there from behind the flywheel, so it just earths things out to stop the motor. Now that that's off, our cowling can be removed. On closer inspection, I think this switch actually disconnects the module from the coil. The yellow wire is probably a low oil switch, so that probably earths the module out. I'm not sure if I don't think the switch actually earthed out, I just think it completed the connection from the module to the coil. Either way, it stops the engine. Now, the oil drain plug for changing the oil, notice that it's actually over the top of the frame, so perhaps that's why it's so oily here, from oil changes that went a bit messy. The other side's exactly the same, so slightly poor design, I guess, but we'll be able to have some sort of little channel to funnel the oil away from there. But it does need to be changed fairly regularly. We'll check the oil now while the camera's in the right position and just make sure it's got oil in it, and we'll see how black it is. Hopefully it's at the right level. Okay, let's get a focus on that. That's a good sign again. I'm more and more confident about this motor. It's fairly clean. It looks like it was around about the right level on the dipstick. So it's good that it's not black and sludgy, or worse, if it looks like mushroom soup, it means we've probably got water into the sump somehow. Generators can end up underwater if they're running near the edge of a river or something in flood. So that's a good sign again. Back to the carby side, and we can see here's our throttle linkage that runs off the governor, and then the other linkage goes back to the throttle on the carby, which all seems to be working quite well. This is a fixed, it's set for fixed revs, so you start the thing and it just goes straight to its running revs. So that's what this adjustment screw is for. I don't know what they actually rev at, but everything seems okay there, other than that little spring has come off. So we'll take this assembly off because it'll give us better access for removing the tank. Well, it's a little awkward to get to this one. Now I can't unless I change the throttle adjustment screw. We should be able to tell where it was set because there'll be a clean spot on the thread, and I can always look up what they should be running at anyway. So let's back this screw off. And now we can get to the bolt. We can probably leave that sit there for now, and we'll undo the bolt. Oh no, we'll take that off. It's going to be in our road otherwise. And now we can access the fuel tank bolt, and there's two on the other side. Now the tank is ready to remove, but we do have the fuel tap down here on the carby, so when we pull the fuel line off, it's going to drain whatever's in the tank all over the bench. So I used to have some proper plastic clamping pliers that were designed to squash the fuel hose and not damage it too much, and they would clamp on there, but I can't find them, as typical with most of the stuff in my shed at the moment. So I'm just going to clamp it with some needle nose pliers here, and hopefully it comes off the barb onto the carby there easily. Yes, it does. So we'll squeeze it off. Hopefully we're getting a little bit of leakage, but hopefully it doesn't tip all over the workbench, because I want to see what the quality of the fuel like is in the bottom of the tank. So there we go. And let's now drain some into a clean container. Now, water always goes to the bottom of a fuel tank. So if there's water in the tank, it will come out first. And that's looking pretty good. It's looking nice and clean. Doesn't look like there's any water there at all. Beautiful. All right, so I'm happy that the fuel's clean, but I'm still going to tip it out because we don't know how stale it is. fuel or gas will go stale if left sit for a long time, because eventually the volatile components of the fuel will evaporate off, even in a fuel tank. So we're going to flush this out, but at least I'm satisfied that there's no contamination in the tank. Okay, everything's looking pretty good at this stage. It is a bit oily around the governor arm here. May have just been weeping a little bit of oil out through a seal there, but I don't think there's any need for concern. We can see where this little spring end here needs to go back in that secondary hole, so we'll be able to refit that easily. I don't think there's any need to take the carby off. We will drop the bowl and make sure the fuel in the bowl is nice and clean. And there's also a little sediment bowl underneath the tap there, if you can see that. So we'll take that off as well and just make sure it's nice and clean. So if the fuel system's clean, we're most of the way there. We know the oil's good. The spark plug actually even doesn't look that old, so we'll take the spark plug out and check that next probably. And before we reassemble, we'll just give this a bit of a wash down just with some petrol and a brush. I'll do that outside so that we don't have the shed full of volatile fumes. But it's looking pretty good. So as long as we have spark and as long as the bowl and the carby's clean, I would say there's every chance it's going to start and run nicely, which is excellent to see. I have another little clean plastic tray underneath here, so we'll take the little bowl off the bottom of the fuel tap. Although this actually won't drip out the bolt because it's one piece. However, we will get fuel go everywhere when we take the bowl off the carby. Okay, so that's full. Tip it out. It looks nice and clean again. Yep, that looks great. So we can happily put that back in. Actually, we might leave that out and I'll explain why when we're putting the tank back on. But I'm pleased that's clean. So let's now have a look in the bowl of the carby, the float bowl. Now we're going to get fuel dripping straight out of the bowl here, as I explained. If we drop the bowl down, it should help capture some of it, because I do like to have a bit of a look in before it all runs down my fingers. And oh, can you see that? That looks beautifully and clean. So fantastic. We have no issues with this fuel system. Although, as I said, it may be stale. And we'll leave the bowl off as well, just for a tick. And make sure the float is free. It's a plastic float. That all looks good under there. Okay, fuel system is ticked off. Next thing's to check the spark plug and see what that looks like. And so it looks fairly clean, so I would say this generator must have been serviced regularly, which is great. I'd say it's done probably a fair bit of work. You don't get this sort of oily residue over the engine block when they don't have much work under their belt, but it looks like it's been well maintained. Okay, let's have a good look at the plug. It looks pretty good, actually. It's a little oily, which is fine. At least there's no, if you see whitish deposits or it's a very light grey colour, you know the thing might have been running a bit lean or getting a bit hot. But that's a pretty normal looking plug. The spark plug gap looks quite good. I think I mentioned in a video recently that if you're unsure of what the gap should be, around about the thickness of a hacksaw blade is a pretty reasonable spark plug gap, would run in just about every application. So that looks great. Now we can see if we have actual spark. So we can connect the boot up to it. Rest it on the alloy head there, which is an earth. Now we will probably need to connect our wires, because I think the switch connected the wires from the module to the coil behind the flywheel. So I don't think we'll get a spark like this. Oops, we've got one of our springs stuck to the magnet. Now if you can see over the frame here, I think the camera's clear of the frame, we've got the flywheel with a magnet, and that's the part there that the screwdriver sticks to, quite a strong magnet, and it goes past this ignition coil. and there needs to be an air gap between the two, so obviously they don't touch, but the gap needs to be as close as possible, and this looks pretty good. And you can have issues with engines where they've been in the weather or got wet and it actually rusts the side of the flywheel, and it'll actually physically bind on the coil, and that will muck up starting, because it'll muck up your spark, not to mention it will cause lots of extra friction. So that passes well with no scrubbing, no scuffing, and we should get a good spark. We have the spark plug earthed here, but we won't get a spark yet because remember we unplugged the ignition wires for the stop switch. And I've now just connected the wires, so everything electrical should be ready to give us a spark. Can I get a spark just by flicking it with my hand? So I think there is. It's a bit hard to tell. You might be able to tell through the camera. Yeah, I saw a spark then. Beautiful. I'm not sure if you guys can see it. Let's zoom in a bit. Of course, it's going to wobble the table a bit as I flick it. So I can see a spark. I'm not sure if you guys could. The problem with these electronic ignitions, and this is an earlier electronic ignition, it just has a module bolted to the side of the engine block, is that they don't actually generate a spark until the revs get to a certain speed. So it has some sort of sensor in there, I believe, so that when you run the magnet past the coil slowly, it won't energize the module enough to give you a spark. Whereas on some of the old points engines, when you have the points and the condenser just right, you can get a spark from very little movement. But these modules do need a fair bit of speed with the magnet going past the coil to give a spark. So anyway, we're able to do it there by flicking it with our hands. So I'm satisfied that the ignition system's in good condition. Our fuel system's in good condition. I think we can pretty well clean up and reassemble. No sense taking the muffler off. We managed to get everywhere we needed to. Don't need to take the carby off because I'm confident that's all going to be clean. So we'll just clean up the block a bit and we'll put it all back together. And through the magic of editing, it's all done. It wasn't much point showing you guys. It was just basically washing it down with a bit of petrol outside, blowing the air compressor around a bit, and it's all nice and clean. The tank didn't clean up very well, but that's as good as we can get. The bowl and everything I've washed out ready for reassembling. Now I mentioned before that I didn't want to put the bowl and the little fuel tap thing on just yet. We're going to assemble the fuel tank first and get the fuel line onto the tap barb here, and then we'll run a bit of fuel through the system so it drips out the bottom, just to make sure that nothing ended up inside the fuel line when we were cleaning things down. And likewise then, once we assemble the tap, we'll make sure a bit of a trickle runs through the bowl of the carby and just make sure the float and the needle work. The tank is back on. Let's turn the fuel switch on, or the fuel tap, and run a bit of fuel through. There we go. That should have cleaned the lines. Now we'll put the little sediment trap back in there, and then we'll do exactly the same thing with a bit of fuel through the carby through the float bowl. Okay, we'll turn the fuel tap on again, and it should fill up. There we go. And we'll just move the float up just to make sure the needle and seat are working fine. For any of you that haven't had much to do with engines, the fuel fills the bowl up, and then little float closes a needle valve to stop more fuel coming in, and the engine runs off the fuel in the carby bowl until it gets low enough to let more in. Working beautifully. Okay, she's all back together, no problems. Assembly is just reverse of the dismantle. Pretty straightforward. Just make sure you've got the governor springs in the right spot. I've cleaned it up a bit, as you can see. It looks a bit better. So we're ready for a start. We know that the bowl of the carby will be full. I've got the ignition switch all wired back up, so make sure that's on. We know it's got enough oil in it. In fact, I'm not going to change the oil because the oil looks so clean. I've left the air filter off for now, just while we get it to start. So I haven't pulled the rope yet. Let's see how we go. So we'll give it some choke first, and we'll pull it over. Not trying to start it, we'll just pull it over a couple of times first. That'll kind of just prime it. Okay, we'll see how we go. I think that kicked. What'd you think of that, Coco? Did that make some noise? That went beautifully. I reckon it actually would have started first pull, but I had the choke on. I didn't have the choke on when I thought it was on. And then when I flicked it back, after I thought the thing had kicked, it was actually on full choke and it fired up straight away. So that sounds really good. The best thing was there was no clouds of blue smoke. I'm sure this engine is in really good condition. The muffler sounds pretty good. I noticed it's still got a spark arrestor screen there, and I did check that before to make sure it wasn't blocked up with carbon. But we can put the air filter back on this. It actually does not need a service. It's essentially, I'm sure it has been serviced recently, or at least it was serviced and then not really used much since. But the oil's fantastic. It looks new. The air filter's nice and clean. Everything ticks boxes. The old fuel might have been okay, but always better to check the system through and flush it if you don't know the history of a motor. Now it is of course a generator, so there's one more thing to check. We know the motor's good. Let's see if it can actually power anything. So we'll start her up again. So guys, I'm going to wrap this up quickly because you shouldn't run an engine in an enclosed shed, so I'm going out for some fresh air. Looks like it works perfectly. The girls should be happy. They'll probably use this for their kitchen or coffee van. So all's good, and you guys have learned how to, well, we didn't have to repair it. We just evaluated it, and well, we didn't even really give it a service, but you know what's involved. Thanks for watching. Catch you in the next video. Bye for now. I'm going for fresh air.